Okay,
Just a
thank you.
tiny bit about me. I'm based on the Surrey-Hampshire border, originally from London. Spent lots of very nice holidays in Wales. Spent my career working in the travel industry and enabled me to see quite a lot of birds. I'm just under 9,000 bird species now out of 11,000 in the world, and hoping to see a few more in a few weeks' time when I go to Colombia. But I've been chair of the Hampshire Ornithological Society for about 8 years now, and before that, I was involved in other county bird clubs and indeed nationally and internationally with the African Bird Club and OSME. So some of you I may have met through that. I've also had a heavy involvement in the BTO as BTO Vice President most recently, but I joined the BTO 50 years ago next year, so I'm really pleased with all the work the BTO is doing with young people. Right, bird migration. So this was a talk I put together at the request of my own local bird club because they said, look, can you tell us a bit about migration? Just the basics, because we've seen huge books by people like Ian Newton, which would take you at least a full year to read from cover to cover. So can you just kind of take us through the basics and explain, why they migrate, how we know all this, and maybe what it's beginning to tell us. So here we go. Well, not everybody understood migration the way we understand it today. If we go back to the days of Aristotle, he basically thought that birds morphed into fish. He'd seen swallows diving down over the water and swifts as well, and I think he maybe thought that they dived into the water, buried themselves in there, or just simply got themselves in the form of a fish, and that's how they disappeared. Fairly obvious explanation. And we lived in ignorance for an awful long time after that, because even Gilbert White from my neck of the woods around here, he thought that swallows hibernated in the mud. So not too different from Aristotle, really. And again, I imagine this probably was because he'd seen them either on the mud, finding, insects, or maybe when he'd seen things like house martins and swallows and swifts going low over the water. Well, anyway, over time, we did start to understand why birds migrate, and in fact that they do. And of course, bird ringing was the real answer to that. Bird ringing started about 110 or 115 years ago now, and over time we've built up a picture of what's going on, and it's
Hello,
still growing, of
Keith.
course, with all the
Can you
satellite
hear
tracking
me?
and so on, which we see today. And
It's
I'm going to talk
frozen.
a bit about that too. So what is migration? Well, migration is basically the return seasonal movement between breeding areas and non-breeding areas. And for most species, it's a north-south
And
movement.
it's not
But,
good.
within places like Africa, it could be an east-west movement following the rains. And we'll talk about that as well. As I mentioned, there are 11,000 bird species in the world, near enough. And actually 2,000 of those migrate. So it's not the majority, it's only a small proportion who actually need to migrate. Of course, we've got four types of birds that are involved in moving. So, I mean, even resident birds do migrate to some extent. They make local movements. You'll notice that locally yourself around Bangor, certain species that, you'll see in gardens and you don't see them in the winter because they're out in the countryside more. We have summer migrants, of course, that come here to breed. We have winter visitors who come here to spend the winter, having bred somewhere else, usually further north. And we have passage migrants who are simply on their way through, um, here today, gone tomorrow, like your Rad's warbler, although that really was a vagrant rather than a passage migrant, I'd argue. But anyway, that's the types of migrants we have. And, why do they migrate? What's the point in doing it? Well, primarily it's to find food because food is going to be in shorter supply in the winter. It won't disappear totally, but there won't be enough to support all the birds if all of them stay where they've been and remain there in the winter. So over time, birds have developed the ability to migrate and move to places where food will be available in much larger quantities. So it's to find food primarily, but also in some cases it's to avoid the extreme cold. Now that's true of birds that are coming to Britain in the winter, so things like waxwings and fieldfares and so on. They're getting away from the cold. Birds like, for example, peregrine, a resident bird as we think of it, but actually we get a lot of peregrines that come from Scandinavia, 85% of all the peregrines that have been ringed overseas and found in Britain have come from Norway, Sweden, and Finland. But in both cases, it's about maximizing survival, making sure the species has a chance to survive. And primarily, we believe it's really controlled by changes in day length. So birds tend to migrate on the same day or around about the same day each year. But more and more, I think climate is having an impact on that. Birds are moving earlier towards Britain in the spring, leaving later in the autumn. It's not all down to day length. Day length is one of the things, but it's not the only thing. Well, we don't get too many winters like this now. Certainly not where I am, and I don't think where you are either. But you can see why birds would not want to be looking for insects in conditions like this. Now, some birds migrate south for the winter, but others do not. So why is that? Well, it's interesting. People say to me, well, hang on, robins and blackbirds, they eat insects, but they stay here. Why don't they migrate? Well, truth is, actually, there's quite a lot of movements between countries of birds that are really familiar to us. And here's some BTO data just showing you robin and blackbird, showing the movements of birds ringed in Britain that have actually ended up going elsewhere in Europe. So you'll see they do move from here and indeed move from there towards us too. So yeah, our local resident birds are actually migrants to some extent. It's really interesting that actually some birds may choose not to migrate if you help them. So for example, in America, some of the hummingbird species in places like California and a bit further north, they do move south, but if you give them sugar water, then they don't necessarily need to go because they're now having food right throughout the year. And why migrate if you really don't need to? So it is changing the migration patterns of some birds by us actually getting in there and giving them extra food. So the main migration routes, as I mentioned, are north-south. This is a very simplified graph, just showing you really a chart showing you where birds go to and come from. But you can see it's pretty similar in America as it is to in Europe and Africa. They head down basically using regular routes in some cases for larger birds. And you'll see that they even go all the way from Russia and above Russia or the Arctic down all the way to the east coast of Australia. Now, this is a rather nice graphic, which I hope will work. This was created by the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology over in the States. And what they did, as far as I know, is they attached little geolocators to a whole bunch of small birds. Now, I don't know what species were involved, but I'm going to say they're going to be warblers, I imagine, in most cases. And they went to see where they went or in each month. So at the moment on that chart, you can see that's January, and they are basically distributed between southern parts of the USA, quite a lot of them in Mexico and Costa Rica, and all the way down into even as far as Argentina. But I'm going to move that on slowly, and you'll see it'll change colour as they go through the breeding season and then to the autumn. So wait for it, they're just about to move. And they're off, right? We're in January, February, they've started moving and they're going through north, changing colour because they're getting into ready to breed. They're now going to go to a greeny yellow colour as they start to head back. I think, there we go, heading back. And as you can see, they head all the way back down to where they came from. Now, this is an amazing bit of tracking they did. So these little geolocators are the ones where you actually remove the data from the bird if you manage to retrap it. So they had to trap an awful lot of birds to do that. And I'm going to show that to you once again. Just need to go back. And what I want you to notice is the speed with which certain birds move. And if you look at the ones that are actually in South America and heading towards North America, you'll see that in many cases they actually overtake, they leapfrog over the birds that are actually further north. So have a look and also notice how much time they spend in Canada and say places like Alaska. It's hardly any time at all. So here we go. They're off again. The ones in the south have started moving already. The ones in the middle haven't really got around to it yet. Off they go. They're overtaking each other. Look at some of those southern ones. Watch the ones in Alaska now, the top left. Yep, hardly there any time at all, and they're on their way back again. So it really just shows you that birds that choose to nest in the most northerly locations are very often those that actually choose to winter in the most southerly locations. And the birds that are actually in the middle, for example, in Mexico and Costa Rica, places like that, they very often only travel into, say, the central USA. So they don't travel very far at all. And those birds are able to breed at least once, probably twice, but the ones that go to Alaska and the northern parts of Canada, they're hardly there any time at all. So they literally get there, start nesting, finish nesting, and they're on their way back. So yeah, very different experience depending on where you live. This is obviously not all the same species. I don't know which species they were. I should find out. Anyway, you could probably find that on the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's database. So anyway, talked about North America. I'm sure plenty of you have been there. My question, actually, you could put your hand up, or well, maybe have a think about it. Do any North American birds migrate from North America to Africa? And you'll see from that chart, it doesn't really look like there are any. But there is, in fact, one North American bird that migrates to Africa, and it's one that you're highly familiar with from where you are, and it is indeed the northern wheatear. So northern wheatears have an amazingly wide distribution all the way across the northern hemisphere. So this is from the Handbook of the Birds of the World, and you'll see they have in that orangey area distribution breeding right the way across Europe into the northern parts of Eurasia. They're in Greenland, they're Iceland, Canada, and of course, as you can see there in Alaska. Well, all of them, absolutely all of them, spend their winter in Africa, in the blue area on the map, and that includes the ones from Alaska. But from doing tracking work on the birds in Alaska, we know that actually they don't travel east across Canada and across the Atlantic. No, they go west. So in other words, they disappear off the left-hand end of this map, suddenly appear half a second later on the right-hand side, and they come all the way across Europe, well, not Europe so much, but Asia, and then down into Africa. So there, yes, there's one species of bird in America that actually breeds there and winters in Africa. And that is something that I don't think too many people really are aware of. So it could be a good dinner party conversation point. Now, some birds only migrate within the continent, and I mentioned this for Africa in particular, and this is a fantastic bird, African pitta. I'm very, very lucky to have seen this 3 times now. Once in Mozambique, when they were nesting, they nest the day after the rain start, and I was there the day the rain was hitting, so they nested the next day or displayed. Seen one I saw one 2 years ago in Liberia or Sierra Leone. I can't remember now. Yes, Sierra Leone in West Africa, and also saw one a couple of years ago in Uganda. But if we look at the map here, this is the African pitta's distribution. So the orange area is Mozambique mainly, which is where they are breeding. And those birds spend their non-breeding season, so I'm not going to call it the winter, I'm just going to say their non-breeding season in Uganda, in the blue area, and further west, which is part of the Congo. Now, if we look at the western side of Africa, you'll see there the distribution's marked in purple. So this is actually a resident population of the African pitta. Now, people are working on this right now. Those birds do not migrate at all. So within one species, we've got two very different kinds of behavior. And there's quite a lot of work going on to see whether, in fact, there is a West African pitta and an East African pitta, two species. Some birds migrate very specifically to follow their food supply. So the Ellanoris falcon's a good example of that. One of their favorite foods, sadly, is the barn swallow, and they will follow swallows and house martins as they head south through Europe into Africa. Now, the Ellanoris falcons are nesting in the Mediterranean and North Africa. You can see them there on the map in the orange areas going around the Med. And then you can see most of them actually winter on Madagascar and a few of them actually inside Mozambique and places like that. So as you look, actually that's not Mozambique, that's Zimbabwe. But if you look there, you'll see that they travel down with the barn swallows and basically have their food as they're going along. It's a good strategy. So I mentioned leapfrog migration earlier, and a good example of that actually is the yellow wagtail. Now, here we've got all of one species. So here's the yellow wagtail distribution. Nothing like as extensive as that in England now, of course, but this would have been true for some time. You've got the area in blue where they winter, the area in orange where they are breeding, and a little bit where it's purple where they actually are the whole time. But here's a good example of leapfrog migration. So the birds in South, South Africa are the ones that breed in the most furtherly north areas in, for example, Norway, and therefore they've got a very long journey, but they can afford to have a long journey because places like Norway are really cold right up until the middle to the end of May. And so there's no point in getting there any earlier because you won't be able to breed, won't be any food. So basically, the ones that are breeding in Spain and places like that and southern parts of Europe, they're the ones that actually are wintering in the northern part of the winter range. And they have a very short journey to go, and they can probably breed twice, but the ones from South Africa can only breed once when they get to Norway. Sorry, rather long-winded that, but basically you understand leapfrog migration, I think. And we also have reverse migration, which again, I think most birders now are familiar with. And this is where a percentage of the population basically takes a wrong turn. You know, there are people who have great difficulty telling left from right, and there is a situation where some warblers and birds like that do actually reverse migrate and they go 180 degrees in the wrong direction. Now, from what I understand, it's nearly always the first winter birds that actually make this mistake. And I imagine that many birds that make this mistake don't survive as a result because they, instead of going somewhere nice and warm, like Southeast Asia, lovely areas like Thailand and Malaysia, they end up going over the Arctic and land in Europe, where it's going to be incredibly cold, and some of them obviously don't survive. But actually, it's quite interesting. Those that do survive have stayed, and now the breeding distribution of yellow-browed warblers is edging further west all the time. So that's an interesting one to watch. I guess milder winters may well have a better survival rating for them going forward. So when they make the mistake, they may not suffer as a result. Interesting. So migration happens at all kinds of altitudes. A lot of it happens low enough down that you can hear redwings over the next month or so flying over your garden if you go out. If you've got the Merlin app, well, why not just put the Merlin app on and stick it in the garden for half an hour? Try and remember to go and get it back, otherwise you might not get your phone back. And have a see as to whether redwings have been calling. But bar-headed goose is a real record holder. They fly at least at 21,000 feet when they're migrating, some of them, which is an extraordinary skill, given that, you know, if we were even standing still at 21,000 feet, we would not be, well, I wouldn't be talking for a starter, and probably wouldn't be alive for very long either. And a lot of birds that are traveling like that, they do go in V formation. We see it with things like Canada geese, even just local birds. But by being in a V formation, the birds towards the back of the V get a saving in energy. So if you're a cyclist and you've ever tried to cycle right up the back end of a bus as it's zooming along, you'll know you get a little bit of drag that takes you along and reduces your effort. So basically here we have cranes, and by going in a V formation, they can each save a little bit of energy. So that's where that comes in. So what about migration and navigation? How do birds do this? So I think this is an area that's really fascinating. It's an area where more people are working on it now, and we're getting to understand better how birds can navigate. I mean, I think for a long time now, we've known at least three of those four sources. So the first one of those is the position of the sun. They have an inbuilt understanding as to where the sun should be at a certain time of the day, and they can move in the direction that they want to in relation to where the sun is. And you can test that by putting them in an artificial situation with an artificial sun, and that is where they will go, or in relation to that. But most birds, small birds in particular, migrate at night. They spend their day feeding. Nighttime is when they're migrating, so they don't have the sun. And instead of that, they do have the stars. And again, using a planetarium, it's been possible to prove by changing the layout of the ceiling in the planetarium where star formations will be, and birds then follow naturally towards whatever you've suggested it should be. So I imagine they understand where the pole star is and navigate from that. But of course, they can't always see the stars either. Cloudy night, they've got to migrate. What do they do? So that's another area where the last thing we discovered was really that magnetic poles are something which birds can detect. Now, I don't think we fully understand how that happens, but it does happen. And again, that's been tested in a laboratory where a magnetic field has been artificially put next to a bird. And then as a result of the field being put there, that bird will jump south if you give it a southerly feeling, or if you reverse it round, it'll go the other way. So then we know that happens. But what about the fourth one, the one that actually has been more recently discovered? And that is simply the fact that birds, some of them anyway, particularly seabirds, have an amazing ability to detect the quality of the water, the content of the water. A bit like a bloodhound, they must have some amazing ability to detect what makes up the oceans. And we don't fully understand it yet, but certainly some seabirds are able to detect their home area by following the smell. Well, some of the birds do travel a long, long way. I mean, I've been very fortunate to be in the Antarctic in what is the British winter. And I've seen Arctic terns down there. And of course, Arctic terns are in Wales and further north in the summer. And in the very far north, of course, during the time they're there, they will have almost constant daylight during the breeding season. And of course, when they're down in the southern hemisphere, again, they're in the extreme areas, they'll have almost constant daylight as well. So as you can see, they probably see more daylight than any other species of bird in the world. Indeed, maybe more than any other animal in the world. Well, people looking at radars for the Ministry of Defense in Israel and other places like that on major migration routes have detected birds on their radar screen. So here's a really old photo from the 1960s showing a couple of military people in Israel pointing to some migrating birds. And this is the sort of thing that they were looking at, although this is a more modern distribution map of bird migration as it goes across. So if you're familiar with the Rift Valley that goes all the way down into Africa, the birds, particularly birds of prey, come down from Russia. They head down through Israel, they head down into the Red Sea area and carry on down the Rift Valley, right down into Kenya, Tanzania, and further south still. And again, this is an amazing number. Again, in Israel, this is in 2002. And here we have on a date in October, 36,000 lesser spotted eagles being seen in one day. And it was important, of course, for the Air Force in Israel to understand when this was happening because they didn't want to lose jets flying into eagles as they were migrating. So it's important to know. Excuse me, I've got an awful cold. I'm a drink. I'm sure some of you are bird ringers. It's a great thing to do. I'm only allowed actually to ring one species, and I'm only allowed to ring chicks. I'm allowed to ring chick stone curlews. So I can't actually ring a blackbird or a blue tit, but I can ring stone curlew chicks, and other ringers can't do that. So if any ringer ever gets a bit cocky with me, that's something I quietly point out to them. So what is the point of bird ringing? And if you haven't done bird ringing and you want to, it's really a good thing to do. Bird ringing is such a popular thing, particularly with young people, but it's important also because we need to know on an ongoing basis how our birds are doing. So basically, bird ringing tells us five things. It tells us the migration routes that birds are using. Now, today, I think we pretty much know almost all of that you'll see from those maps. But it actually importantly shows us sites that are worth saving. So we'll notice from tracking results or from literally the number of birds going through the survival rates in some areas because of having important sites. And we can then message the people who need to know that these are the sites that the birds need. It'll tell us the survival rates and how long the birds are living for. And of course, that'll differ from year to year, depending on the quality of the breeding season or indeed the weather they've encountered. It'll tell us about the condition of birds. Are they in good condition to migrate, or are they actually rather thin and maybe not going to make it? And if you get involved in things like colour ringing, as I do with stone curlews, then it'll tell you the family relationships between individual birds. So I know when I've ringed chicks, I can see when they're in the fields in the autumn flocks with their parents, and I know they've survived that breeding process. And I also know that individual birds that are colour ringed come back to individual fields, and they come back year after year and so on. So we learn a lot from it. Now, Betton will be impressed to see this. So BTO work here being put up in a spotlight. The satellite tracking work is really, really important. This is a satellite tracked cuckoo with its satellite pack on the back of it. And this is the work that goes on. So this is Chris Hewson and others all set up to catch a cuckoo. We've got a dummy cuckoo on a post. We've got a cuckoo call going out on a loudspeaker, and in come male cuckoos from nearby. And they can be then ringed, also given a tracker to head on their way. And of course, they've been doing loads of this. I'm sure you're all aware of it. It's quite an expensive business, but it's told us a lot about cuckoos that we simply wouldn't have found out any other way. So I literally, before we just did the talk, I went on to the BTO website to have a look and see where are our cuckoos today. So obviously one of them, HA, which I suppose must be Harold, hasn't gone very far at all. So Harold, I'm afraid, is probably not alive. But all the others are doing okay, and they're down in the Congo or not far from the Congo, a little bit further north. And the great thing about this is it's allowed us to see differing routes for cuckoos. So here again, the same data. This is again the latest data from this year. And you will see that birds from East Anglia head east across to Holland and places like that, Brussels and Belgium, head down through Europe and head down through places like Italy or across the sea at Sardinia. Whereas the birds, some of them, and it's interesting, they also, in some cases, come from East Anglia. They actually head down through France and through Spain. Now, what we do know about this is that the birds going on that westerly route have a much lower success rate in their migration than the ones in the east. And I think the most likely reason for that is that there's been quite a bad drought in Spain for a long time now, 20 years. And therefore, those birds are going down a route where probably not a huge number of caterpillars on the way. They're maybe going to face a migration across the Sahara, having really not fed enough. Whereas the ones going the eastern route probably get a better supply of food, and they're able to maybe, maintain themselves on that journey. And here we just zoom in on this one. Probably John, not quite sure about this one, but look, this is really zoomed in. This, I think, is in Chad. And you can see the kind of habitat this bird is in, and you can also see whether it moves around and so on. So this is incredible information from a satellite tracked bird. We don't have to track that bird ever again. The information is being sent daily, so long as its solar battery is getting charged. And here again is another bird, lesser spotted eagle, as they had in Israel, with its tracker on. And you can see the chart on the right is showing you we've got some German birds and some Latvian birds, and they go different ways. But basically, you can see there clearly the western bird, two birds, they've gone down across Gibraltar, avoiding going over the water. They don't want to do that. Well, they've got to go over it a bit, but not for long. And then the other birds going through Israel, and also higher up there, they have to go through the Bosphorus in Turkey. So these are all things we knew, but it does tell us an awful lot about how long they take to get there. You'll see where they go when they get to Africa. And of course, birds go to different places. And what is it that makes them go to one place rather than another? And here's something about timing. This is a short-toed eagle, having been ringed up in France. It's made its way down through September, crossing over Gibraltar around about 2nd or 3rd, yeah, the 3rd of October. And then 2 weeks later, it's down in Niger, and you can see the route it took. Well, if you've never actually seen trackers, this is a little bit of information about the trackers. There are various types. So there are light sensitive trackers. So this basically is something which records the sunrise and sunset and therefore the day length. And you need to trap the bird again in order to get that information. Another tracker would be a GPS locator tracker, where here on a jacksnipe, the bird again, it's taking an accurate record of where it's been. I should just say, by the way, the previous one is not very accurate. It'll tell you where the bird is within maybe 100 kilometers. It doesn't matter if it's something like a knot or a soundling, because it doesn't need to be accurate. But here we are with a jacksnipe, and this bird has got a tracker on, and it can be caught again either later the same winter or indeed the next winter. And in the whole time it's been collecting information, take the tracker data off it, and then you can see where it's been quite accurately. But the latest technology allows things like base stations to be used. Now, with jacksnipe, it's still very early days. The BTO have only given permission for 5 jacksnipe trackers to be used so far, and they're going to be going on this year. These are the ones where base station actually collects the data without having to touch the bird. So it has to be within about 100 meters of the bird, and that information naturally gets transmitted across. Now, it's, I say, early days, permission's only just been given, and hopefully we'll be able to find out in the next 2 or 3 years much more about our jacksnipes, where they go to, perhaps particularly areas we want to make sure are protected, where they are wintering. So we've also got satellite trackers, which are, as you've seen before, accurate with their position, data sent to a satellite every few hours or once a day, depending on how much you want to do it, and they're solar powered. Now, if you're not getting a lot of sunlight on these birds, then you can switch down the amount of data you're getting so that it only, for example, transmits every 2nd or 3rd day, so you don't end up using up all the power. But of course, if it's getting loads of sunlight, which it probably will be in Africa, you're probably okay. Well, if you've never been to Gibraltar or this part of Spain near Tarifa, just as you go across to Morocco, across the Strait of Gibraltar, I really recommend doing it, and especially in the autumn, about this time when you can get huge numbers of birds of prey. Not just birds of prey, but also storks, cranes, all kinds of things. Now, large birds need height to fly long distances over water. And the reason for this is that there are no thermals over water. So whereas you get thermals over the land, and that keeps the bird up high because the warm air is rising up all the time, warm air does not rise over water. In fact, if the birds fly over a large area of water and they don't have enough altitude, then they usually have to flap a lot, and sometimes they crash into the water. So that's why they choose the narrowest points like Gibraltar. Now, this is a group of black kites. There's hardly any space left in that tree. These birds have been there overnight, and now it's early morning, and they are just waiting for the sun to really warm up and give them thermals so they can start circling, and then they can head down over to the other side, to Morocco. Incredible. And we've got some amazing cases of endurance. Now, this is a bar-tailed godwit. Bar-tailed godwits are, of course, a bird we see quite a bit of, but they have to decide whether they want to be a sumo wrestler or whether they want to be Usain Bolt, and they actually have to be both. So they have to store up the most amazing amount of fat before they travel, and then when they travel, they have to go as fast as they can. I'm sure you've seen this before, but it's worth repeating. This is a bar-tailed godwit that was tagged, I think it was in Alaska, and it headed down across the Pacific. It didn't stop in Hawaii. It headed towards Hawaii, then it took a bit of a change of direction, kept on going, and it arrived in New Zealand. 8 days, 8 days non-stop at 60 kilometers an hour. An amazing migration. Then spent its winter in New Zealand. And then when it returned back to Alaska, it took a longer route, I think because the winds are different in the spring. And so in March, it headed up the other way. And it took plenty of time about it because, if you've ever been to Alaska, it's basically more snow than you've ever seen in your life. I went to Alaska in the first week of June, and there was still 1 mile of snow and ice between the beach and the sea, which meant I was sea watching with my telescope, and the only birds I could see were a mile away. So if you're Bartel Godwit, you don't have to rush. But what an amazing bit of skill, that Bartel Godwit, not stopping anywhere along that journey. And of course, we've got some incredible birds from Wales that fly around the world. How about Manx shearwater? Here are some trackers put on Manx shearwater to see where they got to. And as you probably know, they head out across the Atlantic. They then go east and south down towards Argentina. So huge numbers of them. And you can see it's a real world traveler. Great bit of technology there tracking those birds. But what we do know is that migration patterns are changing. And that is partly why the ringing is still important. Excuse me. So basically, some migrants are becoming resident. I can give you an example with my stone curlews that I study. They used to leave beginning of October. Now they quite often are still with us in November. They used to come in March. Now they're quite often back in February. And in Norfolk, they not far from the BTO, they actually spent every winter, about 20 of them, spending the entire winter there. But that all ended in 2018 with the huge snowfall with the beast from the east. So that kind of activity is great, excepting that when it gets very cold and you can't find food or you get killed. Some are flying shorter distances. They're not needing to migrate as far south as they used to. So a good example of that, I monitor hen harriers in Hampshire. We used to have easily 20 hen harriers in the New Forest in Hampshire every winter. We're lucky to get more than 2 or 3, maybe 5 at most. Now, you could argue that's because the hen harrier population's been clobbered by people we know who don't like them. But, a lot of those hen harriers, I suspect, came from the continent or they came from parts of northern England. And they don't need to go as far south now. And the ones from the continent don't need to come here. So I don't believe it's just because the population's low. I think it's because those birds don't need to migrate to where we are. And of course, as we all know as well, there's a difference in migratory timing. Birds who are wintering in places like Spain and North Africa, they can detect the change in temperature very easily, and they come north earlier than they used to. Those that migrate from further south are less likely to do that because the triggers that make them migrate are just the normal ones, which are day length. So those are the three ways in which things are changing. And this is a chart just showing you blackcap and chiffchaff. I was born in 1960, so a good year. You'll see that blackcaps back then used to be arriving around about the, I don't know, 15th or so of April. And now you'll see they're arriving, almost at the end of March. And the same is true of chiffchaff. So we're seeing that. And those, of course, are birds that are wintering in Spain and North Africa. So a quick look at where our migrants are going and what we've been discovering about that. A lot of work being done by the BTO and others. Common swift is a good example. Trackers being put on those. These are bird trackers which can be taken off the bird when they return the following summer. So if you looked at the distribution of swift, you'd think, okay, it's pretty straightforward. They probably just go straight down, don't they? But actually, it's nothing like that at all. And here's the work the BTO did, and you can see they headed down, heading down the west side of Africa, then turning east quite sharply, heading across to the center of Africa, spending their time, a lot of them around Mozambique in the winter. Then a big movement they spend quite a lot of time in one area. I'm not quite sure why they go there, but that's part of the Congo. And then they head across the open water off the Gulf of Guinea, and then they rejoin Africa a bit further west. Now, why do they go across the water? Well, I guess there are no predators over the water. That might be one reason, or it more likely is going to be because there's very good winds, which will help them to do it quickly. So that's a bit of work that's only been done in the last 10 years or so, shown us a lot about swifts. Starlings, well, there's a lot of tracking of starlings. And again, we see birds coming to Britain from all around Europe. So our starlings, as you know, in winter are mainly made up of birds from elsewhere. Blackcaps, well, it's a story we're now very familiar with, although general members of the public are fascinated by this, that, here are the blackcaps coming to spend their summer in Britain from Spain and North Africa, and then the ones that are with us in the winter are coming from parts of Europe. So it's a sort of musical chairs for blackcaps. Amazing discovery, only made a few years ago, really, and reinforced by a lot of work that's been done by the BTO just recently. And what about woodcock? Well, most of this is work done by people who actually want to shoot woodcock, unfortunately, but the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust has been tracking woodcock. And you can see here that the woodcock that we have in Britain are mainly coming from places like Russia. So the interesting thing about that is that those birds actually arrive quite late. They probably arrive November, October, November. So if you shoot woodcock, let's say at the beginning of October, you're only going to shoot British woodcock, and our British woodcock are not doing too well. The Russian woodcocks are doing pretty well. So if you wait until November, December, then the chances are you're more likely to be shooting a Russian woodcock than a British one. So there's some quite interesting conservation messages there. And just a bird, we love seeing waxwings. I wonder if we're going to get them this year. It's not been good recently. But here again, some BTO data. Where are our waxwings coming from? Well, as you'll see, Norway, an awful lot of them from Norway, an awful lot of them from Estonia. But I hope you do get waxwings. Here is a flock I photographed a few years ago in Hampshire. Haven't seen anything like that since. But if you do want to see waxwing in your garden, then wearing a hat like this is likely to help. Apparently, they do find that quite attractive. And also, if you've got some fruit in your hand, that really will increase your chances. So on that positive note, there's my email address. If there's anything you want to ask me after this talk, do get in touch. Or if you're thinking of coming to Hampshire, want to do some birding, I'll tell you where you can go. I will stop sharing and I'll hand you back to Nigel, who will chair the questions.
I will indeed. Happy to do so. Thanks, Keith. That was splendid. And whilst you're thinking of questions, giving your email there is reminding me that I promised you I'd give you the email for the BTO if you're able to offer a lift for the Welsh Ornithological Society conference coming up shortly. That email address is wales.info@bto.org. I hope you can help. Well, Keith, if I could start off and just
Sure.
ask you to say a bit more about your work ringing stone curlews, because it's a fascinating bird and you've clearly got so much experience with them. Have you got any particular personal favorite stories about movements or life stories of some of the stone curlews you've ringed and their
Yeah.
migration?
Oh, I've got a couple of stories I can tell you, Nigel. I mean, for a starter, we don't currently colouring them now because we ran out of rings. We ran out of colour combinations. There were 5,000 combinations we could use, and we
Wow.
used them all up.
Yes.
So we had to start with the old colours again, or not bother. And we decided in the end, I think we know enough about stone curlews. We don't need to ring them anymore like that. But I did have one of the last stone curlews I did. I think its colours were something like grey, grey, and grey. But anyway, it came back and it actually nested in the field that it was born in. They nest in the first year, and it
Yes.
nested in the field it was born in. But that field was already still really belonged to its parents,
Mm,
and its parents tolerated it and its partner,
yeah.
and it was a male, by the way, and so they actually nested in the same field. I think it was 90 meters apart, really quite close.
Gosh.
And there was no arguments, yeah, a bit of strutting up and down, but no arguments. And for several years, they nested alongside their parents. And the parents,
Mm,
I think one of them must have died because now we just have one. It's always a spare. But I just thought that was rather nice, and that was
yeah,
great,
it is, isn't it?
to see
Fantastic.
that. What else? I mean, one of the great things about working with stone curlews is that you have to work with farmers and you have to persuade farmers who sometimes haven't been paid any money to do
Mm,
anything because they don't plan to have stone curlews always,
mhm,
but persuade them to allow the stone curlews to nest, and also then when they do the harvest, make sure they don't kill them.
mm,
So I've had farmers literally whether on a radio with me, and when the stone curlew, when the harvester is coming along the field, we get to the final bit. I know there are stone curlew chicks in that field there. Wait, stop. We talk to them on the radio. Outrun the chicks.
mm.
They don't like the noise. And then four of us run after these stone curlew chicks because they can run faster than you can. And two go around the back, so we kind of go on a flanker, corner them. They sort of stop, think, "Oh, what do we do now?" And then we grab them. So we get them out of the field. And it's great because you save lives when you do that.
Well done. Thank you. Any other questions, please?
Just one other observation. Stone curlew poo is the most pungent bird poo I've
Really?
ever encountered, and they mainly eating worms, and I
Yeah.
really don't know why this is, but it
Oh,
absolutely stinks. And
good.
I put a cup in the back of my car just to keep them safe, and yeah, had to
Yeah.
clean out the car
Well,
afterwards,
thanks
and
for the warning.
took
Right.
weeks before I could get rid of the smell. Anyway, enough of that.
Uh, any any questions for Keith?
Yeah, yes, Keith. Just
Keith,
just wanted to say thank you very much. Great talk as always, and some really interesting facts. And I mean, I always find it bizarre with some species. It's like with Eleonora's falcons and sooty falcons. They breed in the sort of Mediterranean, in the Middle East, and they winter in Madagascar.
Mm,
I mean, have you got any ideas why that would be? Why is it so local like that?
mm,
It's a bit like with the shelducks going to the Wadden Sea to
yeah.
do their molt.
Well, I mean, the first question I'd ask is, have they always done that? And they may not have always done that. This may just be part of a former, wider wintering range, and things change. The climate has changed dramatically many, many times in the life of birds. So, who knows is the answer to that. I mean, birds have been with us, what, 150 million years or thereabouts?
Hmm.
How many times have the distribution of those birds, if they've lived for say even a third of that, how has their distribution changed over those times?
Yeah.
So I don't really have the answer to that, but yeah, there are some amazing examples of that.
And I was blown away. Was it a few years ago when they did research? Was it from Fetler with redneck phalaropes? And we always
Yes,
presumed they wintered off the west coast of Africa, but they actually migrated across the Atlantic, across Central America, and wintered off
yep,
the west coast of Peru.
that's
I mean,
right. So
that's
basically, those birds in Shetland are part of the North American range of
right.
the redneck phalarope, and the European ones primarily go down to off the coast of Yemen.
So it's a bit like the wheat ears.
mm,
It is actually, yeah. I mean, I don't know how many people knew that Wheatia story. I
Mm.
genuinely didn't know it. I was actually in Alaska a few years ago, and I was looking at Wheatias, and I was thinking, how are they going to get to Africa? And I just checked it, and there they went. They went west.
Yeah, yeah. Like with the Pekinensis swifts, their
Yeah,
migration's mental, isn't it? Sort of
it is.
still going to Africa. And I did like the way, I mean, obviously, I think most of us are aware of the immense migration of the bar-tailed godwit. Um, but I did like when you actually showed the map, it did appear as if they're migrating in the shape of a love heart, which I thought was very nice. Yeah, I was wondering if they'd done that on purpose. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, no, that was good. But I heard an interesting fact about 20 years ago at South Africa, and the guide there was telling me that some European species like European beater and black stork that would migrate to Southern Africa for the winter. Some of them had actually started to actually breed in South Africa,
Yeah.
and then were doing a reverse migration, but they weren't coming back to Europe. They'd actually go in their winter. They'd actually migrate to sort of Central Africa for the winter, which I thought that was, ingenious, because I suppose it's saving them migrating sort of half the distance really. But
Yeah.
it's a wonderful topic, migration, Keith, and
It
thanks
is.
for sort of telling us even more about it.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
no,
Thank
not at
you.
all. I mean, I think what I find amazing about migration is that obviously birds do it in order to survive, to increase survival.
Mm,
But actually migrating has a cost. You have
Mm.
to do an amazing amount of traveling. You've got to guarantee to find food along the way, otherwise you maybe won't survive when you get there.
yeah.
So actually, if you don't have to migrate, I imagine over time birds would choose not to do it. So
Right.
Mm.
as the climate warms, I think it'd be fascinating to find out what our bird populations are going to look like, and indeed the
Mm,
species we have in 100 years' time.
yeah.
Mm.
I'm curious to know from you, and I'll carry on answering questions, but how many young members do you have in your club now? And by that I mean people at school or at university, because as I think you know, I've made it a personal campaign. I've written to every bird club in the country to try and get every bird club to give free membership to young people, and I'm pleased to say more than half now do. Um, but many of them are not getting young people to join. So I just wondered,
Mm.
how you're doing on that.
We give free membership for young people, particularly in our case, being affiliated with Bangor University, to our own students
Sure.
in Bangor. The students also have their own ornithological society, which is affiliated to ours. Um, and so I think the situation in North Wales is you know is good for nurturing youngsters, which is so important. And
Mm,
it's really pleasing to hear that so many are aiming to go down for the conference in a week's time in
great.
Aberystwyth. Um, I think there's been a resurgence in an interest in ornithology, certainly at academic level in recent years. And again, that's reflected at Bangor with
Mm,
some strong research projects on ornithology. And of course, we're very lucky in having the BTO Wales office embedded within the university.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
that's a win-win for all young people and indeed not so young people involved with ongoing projects. So no, I think it's quite favourable here in Northwest Wales, although we'd still like to get more. I think probably there's still a rather a dearth at school level,
Sure. I saw
particularly.
Gethin just posted a little comment there. Gethin, are you able to just unmute and tell me a bit more about that? You say 180 signed up to the Birdwatching Society at the Freshers' Fair last month. So that's the University Birdwatching
Mm,
Society, presumably.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they're. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, so yeah, they're a great society. It was a shame I wasn't in the Freshers' Fair myself. Actually, I was in the Scotland office at the time. But yeah, like a massive resurgence, and there's a few people I can see in the audience who are in the committee of that society. But yeah, to give context, I think last year when I was in the Freshers' Fair, I think we had like 75. So to have
Excellent.
an extra 100 people, I think was absolutely fantastic. And I just got to say I've been incredibly impressed with the Birdwatching Society from what I've seen over the last 2 years. It's in very capable hands. They do things every week, sometimes two or three things every week, and it's just fantastic. Getting to know them, meeting new people year on year, and just enjoying birds with them. Just yeah, absolutely great. There's I think four birdwatching societies in Wales. Aberystwyth have one as well. Cardiff have one as well.
Fabulous.
USW and Swansea, I think, have like a wider kind of conservation society. But yeah, I would say Bangor are certainly up there with the best. So I should imagine in the UK, I can't imagine how a lot of
Absolutely
birdwatching
true.
societies could be much better. Absolutely fantastic.
Sheffield are pretty good. I
Yeah.
think Cambridge is pretty good too, but
Mm,
that's fantastic. I wish down where we are, Portsmouth and Southampton, the bird watching societies just seem to be a shambles. But I'm pleased to
mm,
say in Hoss, Hampshire Ornithological Society, when I became chair 8 years ago, we had two young members out of 1,500 members. So I decided to do something about it, and now we've got 100, which is really fantastic. And they age from 7 to 22, so really pleased.
Keith, I came down in I think it was March to see your lesser spotted woodpeckers after your
Yes.
last talk, and one of the things I was really chuffed to see we was in one of the, I'm not sure exactly where we were, but we were in a holly wood, which is something we don't really have up here. And we bumped into a young ornithologist club, and they were sort of ringing birds, and there was quite a lot of youngsters there. There's probably
Yeah.
about 20, 30. We got to see tree creep in the hand. I was only gutted we were 5 minutes behind seeing a hawfinch in the hand, which
Yeah, that's what
obviously,
they may be doing
yeah,
there. Yeah, we've
yeah.
got more
So that would
hawfinches,
be
I
good.
think,
But it
in
was nice to see
Avon.
a very
Yeah.
active young ornithologist club down there.
No,
Yeah,
that's great.
yeah.
Any more questions? I've been rambling on. Yes,
Barbara, yeah.
Barbara, I can see your hand. How are you?
Yes, thanks. Hello. Brilliant talk. Thank you very much. Learnt loads. Um, I'm interested in why some migrating birds bother to migrate as far as Britain when there are so many more of them in continental Europe and the conditions there seem fantastic for them. I'm thinking of the huge numbers of swifts that one sees in France, other countries as well, all the swallows that are in Greece. Why do the ones that come so far north do it? Have you any views?
I do. I think it's that birds are programmed to go to where they have come from. So if you were born in Wales, you're probably going to go back to Wales. If you're born in Hampshire, you're probably going to go back to Hampshire. I think they're programmed to go to where they came from. And I think the where you see changes in distribution are things like Buick swans. So, for example, we used to have loads of Buick swans in the winter. We don't have them now, and the reason we don't have them is because you know it's nice and pleasant in Holland now. They don't need to fly across the North Sea. They can just stop in Holland. So I think breeding distribution ranges take quite a long time to change, but wintering distribution changes can change really quickly, because they just don't need to go as far as they did. Obviously, over time, distribution of all these birds is changing. If you look at the Climatic Atlas of Birds, which is a wonderful book that was put together about 20 years ago, that predicted the distribution of every bird in Europe in 100 years, assuming that climate change, frankly, wasn't sorted out. So probably quite realistic. And actually, the distribution of almost every bird moved north over that time by something between 200 to 300 kilometers. And that predicted straight away that we, for example, were going to lose our willow tits. Well, we've lost them already. And now in the Midlands, in England, Leicestershire and so on, Derbyshire, they've got more willow tits than marsh tits. So it just shows willow tits are moving north, willow warblers are moving north. So quick answer is that they do change eventually with time, but it's to do with climate and availability of food. And other than that, they just keep coming back to where they were born because that's what they know.
Despite the fact that, as you said, there's a large loss of energy, usage of energy in carrying on going north when they could settle further south. So it's just sort of a not very adaptive behaviour then.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could argue they maybe don't know whether Spain's any good for them, but they're programmed to go to where they were born, and because that's what they've got in their head. I was born here, so it must be quite good. My parents chose to be here. I'll go up there.
Thank you.
It's a very general answer, but I think
No,
it's probably about right.
I suspect it is that instinct's a powerful thing in the evolutionary sense. There's been quite a lot of recent research, Keith, on the correlation between geomagnetic anomalies and also increased solar activity in disrupting migration and leading to increased frequency of vagrants. Have you any thoughts on that?
I don't actually, but I agree. It's a fascinating area and one that, I'm sure we're going to know more about over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. Well, look, we've put you through the mill this evening when you're so indisposed with a heavy cold. I'm very grateful to you for, as Steve said, absolutely splendid talk. As per usual, you've done us proud. It was really lucid, comprehensive, and up to date. Everything we now expect from you, Keith. But to give it on what I know for you is a fairly recently evolved topic, that's wonderful. Some super examples, both those that you know so well from home and those much further afield, but they all coerced into a wonderful story about what is a global phenomenon, probably our most powerful demonstration of migration of any group of animals on the planet. It's birds, certainly for us here in Europe, and it's a wonderful biannual reminder of the force of nature, and one which I think is really deep set in the human psyche, something we can measure the health of the environment by. And I hope that's going to prove very important in trying to moderate excessive climate environmental change in the future. If we can point to migrating birds and the positive and negative effects that we see as a result of our activities, then that's all the better. But all the fresh scientific understanding is so exciting. Would that we were 40 years younger and embracing all this new technology as young researchers. And I envy all those that are in that position at the moment. It's just a fantastically exciting time using different tracking methods. Well, you've put it all in the round, given a really holistic overview of it this evening in a relatively short space of time. We're most grateful to you. It was beautifully illustrated as well. Thanks, Keith. You do fantastic service to so many people with your broadcasting, your writing, and as we've learnt this evening, with your speaking. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Much appreciated.
Thank you.